On her wedding day, a bride faces the ultimate choice when her past and present collide. Two men, one promise, and a truth that changes everything. Will she follow her heart or break it? The aerial view reveals a sprawling estate, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon sunlight. Rows of vibrant flowers line the pathways, leading to an opulent wedding venue where shimmering drapes of gold and ivory cascade from towering arches. Guests, dressed in their finest attire, glide gracefully across the grand courtyard, their laughter mingling with the soft melodic notes of a live orchestra. The scene exudes celebration, elegance, and an air of perfection. Inside the grand hall, the magnificence continues. A massive crystal chandelier dominates the vaulted ceiling, scattering tiny rainbows across the room. Tables adorned with intricate floral arrangements create a visual feast, while the scent of fresh roses fills the air. At the center of it all stands the wedding altar, a masterpiece draped in silk and framed by cascading bouquets of white lilies and golden orchids. The bride stands before a full-length gilded mirror, a vision of unparalleled beauty. Her gown, crafted from the finest ivory fabric, shimmers with subtle sequins and beads, catching the light with every movement. The veil, delicately embroidered with fine lace, frames her soft, radiant features. Her lips press together as she adjusts her earrings, her trembling fingers betraying an unspoken nervousness. Her eyes, though outwardly calm, flicker with hints of uncertainty as she gazes at her reflection. Her bridesmaids flutter around her, offering compliments and making small adjustments to her gown and veil. Their voices fade into the background as the bride's thoughts wander. She casts a fleeting glance at the doorway, her gaze lingering as though expecting someone to appear. A soft sigh escapes her lips as she turns back to face her reflection, forcing a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. In a separate room, the groom exudes confidence and composure. His tailored tuxedo fits him perfectly, accentuating his proud stature. He adjusts his cufflinks with a satisfied smirk, exchanging light-hearted banter with his groomsmen. His tone carries an air of certainty as he declares, "Today is the day." His movements are deliberate, his confidence unwavering, as though the world itself bends to his will. The groom strides toward the ceremony hall, nodding to guests who offer their congratulations. His steps are purposeful, and his demeanor radiates pride and anticipation. Meanwhile, the camera shifts back to the bride, who now holds her bouquet tightly, her knuckles turning white. She takes a deep breath, composing herself, and begins her walk toward the ceremony. The orchestral music swells as the bride steps into the grand hall. Guests rise, their faces lighting up with admiration as they watch her move gracefully down the aisle. The groom, standing tall at the altar, smiles warmly as his gaze locks onto her. Yet, the camera lingers on the bride's face, capturing the subtle tension in her expression, a delicate mix of beauty, determination, and unease. The grandeur of the moment surrounds her, but beneath it lies an unshakable feeling that something is about to disrupt the carefully crafted perfection. The guests sit in neat rows under the glow of the massive chandelier, their murmurs filling the grand hall like a low hum. Women in dazzling dresses and men in tailored suits exchange glances and whispered words, their conversations a mixture of admiration for the bride and speculative gossip. "She looks stunning," one guest whispers, leaning toward her companion. "But did you notice? She seemed a little nervous." Her friend nods subtly, her gaze flickering toward the aisle. Another group chuckles softly, their eyes darting between the groom and the lavish decor. "He spared no expense," one man comments, gesturing toward the ornate floral arrangements and glittering chandeliers. "This is the wedding of the year." The hum of conversation swells as the bride moves gracefully down the aisle. Eyes follow her every step, some with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with envy. The groom stands at the altar, his confident smile unwavering, basking in the attention of the crowd. All seems perfect, a picturesque moment frozen in time. Then suddenly, the grand doors at the back of the hall swing open with a dramatic creak, breaking the serene atmosphere. The orchestral music falters, and the collective murmurs of the guests come to an abrupt halt. All heads turn toward the entrance, their faces a mix of confusion and intrigue. There, silhouetted against the soft light spilling in from outside, stands a tall figure. He steps into the hall, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, his sharp, commanding presence instantly filling the space. His suit, immaculately tailored, exudes wealth and authority, but it is his piercing gaze and the air of confidence around him that hold everyone's attention. The guests exchange bewildered glances, their whispers erupting once again in hushed tones. "Who is that?" someone murmurs. "Isn't that Khalid al-Mansour, the billionaire?" another voice answers, tinged with awe and disbelief. As he strides further into the hall, his eyes lock onto the bride, his expression unreadable but intense. The murmurs among the guests grow louder, their shock palpable. "What is he doing here?" one woman whispers urgently, clutching her partner's arm. The bride freezes mid-step, her breath hitching as her bouquet trembles in her hands. Her eyes widen, meeting his, and for a moment, the entire room seems to hold its breath. The groom's confident smile falters, confusion and annoyance flickering across his face as he follows the gaze of the bride and the guests. Khalid stops a few steps from the first row of seats, his presence towering over the scene. "This wedding cannot continue," he declares, his deep voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Gasps ripple through the crowd, and the bride's trembling hands clutch her bouquet even tighter. The groom steps forward, his face contorted with anger. "Who do you think you are?" he demands, his voice rising. "This is my wedding." The guests erupt into murmurs again, their whispers carrying a mixture of shock and intrigue. "He stopped the wedding?" one voice echoes, barely above a whisper. "This is insane." The tension in the room thickens as Khalid stands firm, his gaze never leaving the bride. The air crackles with anticipation, and it's clear that this moment is only the beginning of the storm about to unfold. The grand hall falls silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone like a tangible force. Khalid stands tall and unyielding, his piercing gaze locked onto the bride. She takes a shaky step back, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of shock, fear, and something unspoken. The bouquet in her trembling hands lowers slightly, forgotten in the intensity of the moment. Her lips part as though she wants to speak, but no words come. The groom, standing at the altar, looks from the bride to Khalid, his confusion quickly turning to anger. His once confident posture stiffens, and he strides toward the intruder, his fists clenched at his sides. "Who are you?" he demands, his voice sharp and edged with fury. "And what do you think you're doing here?" Khalid's eyes flicker briefly to the groom, but his focus immediately returns to the bride. He takes a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence radiating control and authority. "I've come for the bride," he says, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silences even the murmurs of the crowd. "She belongs to me." Gasps ripple through the guests, their shock audible. The groom's face hardens, his jaw tightening as he takes a protective step toward the bride. "You're insane," he snaps, his voice rising. "This is my wedding, my bride. You have no right to be here." The bride's breath catches, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her gaze flits between Khalid and the groom, her emotions a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and something more, something she can't quite suppress. Her grip on the bouquet loosens, and it falls to the floor with a soft thud, unnoticed by anyone but her. Khalid's expression doesn't change. His calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the groom's growing rage. "I have every right," he says, his tone unyielding. "Ask her." The bride flinches at his words, her hands twisting together as her eyes dart away from both men. The groom turns to her, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What is he talking about?" he demands. "Do you know him?" The room seems to hold its breath, every guest's attention fixed on the bride. She hesitates, her lips trembling as she struggles to find the words. She begins, but her voice falters, and she shakes her head helplessly. The tears in her eyes glisten under the soft glow of the chandeliers, hinting at an inner turmoil she's been desperately trying to hide. Khalid takes another step forward, his voice softer now but no less commanding. "Tell him, Aisha," he says, using her name for the first time. Tell him who I am. Tell him what we shared." The bride gasps softly at his words, and her shoulders sag as though the weight of her secret has finally become too much to bear. The groom looks at her, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion and hurt. "What is he saying?" he asks, his voice quieter now, laced with desperation. The bride's lips tremble, but she remains silent, unable to meet his gaze. Khalid's eyes soften slightly, but his determination remains. "You promised me," he says, his tone a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You swore you'd never forget." The groom's anger reignites, and he steps between Khalid and the bride, his fists clenched. "Whatever she promised you is in the past," he says, his voice shaking with rage. "She's mine now." But Khalid doesn't flinch. His calm, almost sorrowful gaze remains on the bride. "You know that's not true," he says quietly. "You can feel it, just like I can." The tension in the room is unbearable, the air thick with unspoken truths and emotions threatening to boil over. The bride's shoulders shake as silent tears stream down her face. The groom turns to her once more, his voice breaking. "Aisha, please, tell me this isn't true." The bride takes a shaky breath, but her response doesn't come. The weight of the moment hangs heavily over everyone, the silence deafening as the storm of emotions builds toward an inevitable eruption. The silence in the room is broken by the sharp sound of Khalid's voice, firm and unyielding. "I'm not leaving," he declares, his words echoing through the grand hall. His commanding presence seems to grow even larger, his posture rigid with determination. Not until the truth is laid bare. The groom's face flushes with anger, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're out of your mind," he growls, stepping closer to Khalid, his tone filled with fury. "You've interrupted my wedding, made these ridiculous claims, and now you refuse to leave? Who do you think you are?" Khalid doesn't flinch. His sharp, unwavering gaze remains fixed on the bride, who stands frozen in the middle of the aisle. Her once pristine bouquet lies forgotten at her feet, its delicate petals scattered on the marble floor. Her hands tremble, clutching the folds of her gown as though trying to ground herself. Her wide, tearful eyes dart between Khalid and the groom, her expression a storm of fear, guilt, and confusion. The tension is palpable, and the guests begin to murmur among themselves, their voices a low hum of curiosity and disbelief. "What's going on?" one whispers, leaning toward their neighbor. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" "It's impossible," another replies, shaking their head. "She wouldn't have kept something like this a secret, would she?" A group of women exchange glances, their voices hushed but urgent. "Look at her face," one of them says, gesturing subtly toward the bride. "She's not denying it. Maybe there's something between them." The murmurs grow louder, the guests splitting into factions of speculation. Some cast sympathetic glances toward the bride, while others glare at Khalid with open hostility. A few whisper their concerns for the groom, who stands protectively in front of the bride, his back rigid and his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. Khalid finally shifts his gaze from the bride to the groom, his tone calm but heavy with meaning. "You may think you know her," he says, his voice measured, "but there's a part of her life she's never told you about, a part she promised to me." The bride flinches at his words, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of his statement has physically pressed down on her. Her lips part as if she wants to speak, but no sound escapes. Her silence speaks volumes, and the groom turns toward her, his anger giving way to confusion and hurt. "Aisha," he says softly, his voice trembling, "is there any truth to what he's saying? Did you know him? Did you promise him something?" The bride's tear-filled eyes meet his, but she can't bring herself to respond. Her hesitation only fuels the whispers among the guests, their voices now a chaotic blend of questions, accusations, and speculation. "She's hiding something," someone says. "But what? And why now?" Khalid takes a step forward, his presence dominating the space between them. "She and I share a bond that goes deeper than you could understand," he says firmly. "She belongs with me, not because of some claim, but because of the truth she's too afraid to admit." The bride stumbles back a step. her breathing ragged as her emotions threaten to overwhelm her. Her gaze falls to the floor, unable to face the weight of Khalid's words or the piercing questions in the groom's eyes. The whispers among the guests swell to a crescendo, their divided opinions forming the backdrop of this unfolding drama. The groom's voice cuts through the noise, sharp and demanding. "Aisha, look at me," he says, his tone trembling with urgency. "Tell me the truth. Who is he to you?" The bride raises her eyes, her lips quivering, but the answer remains locked within her. The room seems to hold its breath, every gaze fixed on her trembling form as the unspoken truths linger in the air, threatening to shatter the fragile facade of the perfect day. The groom's patience snaps, his voice rising in anger as he steps toward Khalid. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouts, his face flushed with fury. "You have no right to be here, and you certainly have no right to make these outrageous claims." His tone is sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd demanding their attention. Khalid remains calm, his expression unshaken by the groom's outburst. He takes a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them, his towering presence adding weight to his words. "You think I'm lying," Khalid says, his voice low but firm, carrying an edge of menace. "Do you truly believe she would have told you everything?" The groom's eyes narrow, his anger simmering into suspicion. "What are you talking about?" he demands, his voice quieter now, but no less forceful. "If you're so sure of this so-called bond, prove it." Khalid's lips curl into a faint smirk, but his eyes remain serious. "Proof?" he says, tilting his head slightly. "You want proof? Very well." He turns his gaze to the bride, his expression softening slightly. "Aisha," he begins, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "Tell him about that night, the one by the old bridge. Tell him what you said to me." The bride freezes, her body rigid as though struck by his words. Her hands tremble, and she clutches the folds of her gown tightly, her knuckles turning white. Tears well up in her eyes, glistening under the golden light of the chandeliers. But she remains silent, her gaze locked on the floor. The groom catches her reaction and steps closer to her, his tone turning desperate. "What is he talking about?" he asks, his voice a mixture of anger and hurt. "What happened by the bridge, Aisha? Why won't you say anything?" The bride's lips part, but no words come. Her shoulders sag under the weight of the moment, and a single tear escapes, sliding down her cheek. The room feels heavier, the tension thick and oppressive as the guests watch, captivated by the unfolding drama. Khalid steps forward again, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You can't run from the past, Aisha," he says, his tone a mix of authority and sorrow. "You made a promise that night, a promise to me, and now you stand here pretending it never happened." The bride's breath catches in her throat, and she shakes her head slightly, as if trying to deny the truth without speaking. Her silence only fuels the groom's anger. He turns back to Khalid, his voice rising again. "This is all manipulation," he shouts. "You're trying to confuse her, to twist her mind with lies. She doesn't belong to you. She's my wife-to-be." Khalid doesn't respond immediately, his piercing gaze fixed on the bride. The intensity of his silence speaks volumes, filling the room with a quiet tension that makes the guests hold their breath. Finally, he speaks, his words deliberate and cutting. "A bond like ours doesn't just disappear," he says. "It lingers, no matter how much you try to bury it." The bride flinches at his words, her tears now streaming freely down her face. Her hands tremble as she raises them to her face, covering her mouth to muffle a quiet sob. Her reaction speaks louder than any words could, leaving the groom momentarily stunned. He looks at her, his expression shifting from anger to pain, as though the cracks in his perfect day are finally too large to ignore. The guests whisper among themselves, their voices a mix of shock, confusion, and intrigue. "What happened between them?" one woman asks quietly. "It must be something serious if she's reacting like this." "Do you think she still loves him?" another guest murmurs, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Look at her face, she's barely holding it together." The groom turns back to Khalid, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Whatever you think you had with her, it's over," he says, his words coming out like a growl. "She chose me. This is my wedding, and you have no place here. But Khalid stands firm, his expression resolute. You may think you've won her, he replies, his tone calm but cutting. But the truth always has a way of finding its way to the surface, and when it does, you'll see that she was never truly yours. The groom's fists clench, and the bride's quiet sobs become the only sound in the room, filling the silence left in the wake of Khalid's words. The tension lingers, thick and suffocating, as the weight of unspoken truths hangs heavily over everyone present. The groom steps closer to the bride, his voice tight with frustration and desperation. Aisha, he says, his tone louder than before, demanding her attention. What is he talking about? Why won't you say anything? His eyes search her face for answers, but she turns her gaze away, her hands trembling as they clutch the edges of her gown. The bride struggles to compose herself, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her lips part as though she's about to speak, but no words come out. Instead, she swallows hard, her gaze fixed on the floor. Tears threaten to spill over, and her reluctance to meet the groom's eyes only adds fuel to his growing anger. Why won't you just say something? He pleads, his voice breaking slightly. Tell me it's not true. Tell me he's lying. The silence is deafening, broken only by the murmurs of the guests, who lean forward in their seats, their curiosity overtaking their decorum. Why isn't she saying anything? One guest whispers. If it's all a lie, why doesn't she deny it? The tension in the room feels like it's on the verge of snapping when Khalid steps forward, his voice calm but unwavering. Because she can't deny it, he says, his sharp tone cutting through the whispers. All eyes turn to him as he stands tall and resolute, his piercing gaze fixed on the bride. She knows the truth, even if she's too afraid to say it. The bride flinches at his words, her hands rising to her face as though to shield herself from the weight of the moment. The groom turns toward Khalid, his face contorted with rage. You're just here to ruin this day, he spits. You're trying to manipulate her with your lies. Whatever you think you had with her, it's over. Khalid's expression doesn't waver. If anything, his resolve seems to deepen. He steps closer, his eyes never leaving the bride. It's not over, he says firmly, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. I'm here to fulfill what we started. Gasps ripple through the crowd, and the bride's knees buckle slightly as if the words themselves have struck her physically. Her shoulders shake, and a soft, stifled sob escapes her lips. The groom's face flushes with a mix of anger and confusion. What does that even mean? He shouts, his voice cracking. What did you start? Khalid takes a deep breath, his expression softening slightly as he speaks directly to the bride. Aisha, he says, his tone gentler now, almost pleading. You made a promise you haven't forgotten. I'm here because I believed in that promise, and I still do. The bride shakes her head slowly, tears streaming down her face, but still she doesn't speak. The guests whisper louder now, their voices filled with speculation and intrigue. What kind of promise? One murmurs. Do you think they were in love? The groom steps between Khalid and the bride, his protective instincts flaring as he glares at Khalid. Whatever you think she promised you, it doesn't matter, he says, his voice trembling with rage. She's marrying me today. You need to leave. But Khalid stands his ground, his presence unshakable. Ask her, he says simply, his voice steady. Ask her if she's truly ready to leave behind what we had. Ask her if she's truly yours. The groom turns to the bride, his expression filled with anguish. Aisha, he says, his voice softer now, tinged with vulnerability. Please, just tell me the truth. Tell me that whatever he's saying doesn't matter. Tell me you choose me. The bride looks up, her tear-streaked face filled with turmoil. Her lips tremble as she struggles to find the words, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The room falls silent, every eye fixed on her as she stands at the center of a storm she can no longer avoid. Khalid steps forward, his eyes briefly softening as he looks at Aisha, but his tone remains firm and commanding. You want to know the truth? He begins, his voice echoing through the silent hall. Then let me tell you what she won't. Years ago, long before this day, Aisha and I made a promise to each other, a promise that bound us in ways none of you could understand. The bride's breath catches, her tears still streaming as her gaze remains fixed on the floor. The groom looks from Khalid to Aisha, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he says firmly, his voice trembling. "This can't be true. She would have told me. She would have—" Khalid cuts him off, his tone sharper now. "She didn't tell you because she thought she could escape the past, but some promises are too powerful to ignore, no matter how hard you try to forget." The murmurs among the guests start again, their hushed voices speculating about what Khalid could mean. "A promise?" someone whispers. "What kind of promise could he be talking about?" Another guest leans forward, their voice tinged with curiosity. "It must have been serious if she never told the groom." Khalid's voice grows quieter, more reflective, as he begins to weave fragments of his story. "It was a night I'll never forget," he says, his gaze distant, as though seeing the memory unfold before him. "It was at the old bridge, under the stars. Aisha had just come into my life, a light in the darkness I didn't realize I needed. We were young, foolish, and filled with dreams." The scene shifts into a flashback, vivid and emotional. A younger Khalid stands on a weathered bridge, his suit less polished, but his presence just as commanding. Beside him is Aisha, her simpler attire and carefree demeanor contrasting sharply with the woman she is now. The air is warm, the stars twinkling above them, and a faint breeze carries the sound of their laughter. In the memory, Khalid reaches for Aisha's hand, his voice filled with vulnerability. "Promise me," he says softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Promise that no matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, we'll find our way back to each other." Aisha hesitates for a moment, then smiles, her youthful innocence shining through as she nods. "I promise," she says, her voice filled with sincerity. The memory fades, leaving Khalid standing in the present, his expression a mix of longing and determination. The guests watch in stunned silence, the weight of the story settling over them. The groom, however, refuses to accept it. "No," he says again, louder this time. "This is some kind of trick, a lie. She would never have kept something like this from me." Khalid's gaze hardens and he turns to the groom. "It's not a lie," he says firmly. "Ask her yourself. Look at her. Does she look like someone who doesn't remember?" The groom turns to Aisha, his voice breaking. "Aisha, please, say something. Tell me this isn't true." Aisha raises her tear-filled eyes to meet his, her lips trembling as she struggles to find the words. She begins, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought it was in the past." The groom stumbles back, his disbelief turning to anger. "You thought it was in the past?" he repeats, his voice filled with hurt. "You promised him? And you never told me?" Khalid steps closer, his tone quieter but no less intense. "She didn't tell you because she was afraid," he says. "Afraid of what the truth would mean. But that doesn't change the fact that her promise is real." The room feels charged with emotion, the tension so thick it's almost suffocating. Aisha's shoulders shake as her silent tears continue to fall, her inner turmoil laid bare for all to see. The groom looks at her, his voice now a desperate whisper. "How could you keep this from me?" The guests sit in stunned silence, their gazes shifting between the three figures at the center of the drama. The weight of Khalid's revelations, the bride's silent pain, and the groom's disbelief hang in the air, leaving everyone on edge as the story inches closer to its breaking point. Aisha stands frozen in the center of the aisle, her trembling hands clutching at the folds of her gown as though they might anchor her to the ground. Silent tears stream down her face, glistening under the soft glow of the chandeliers. Her chest rises and falls with shallow breaths, and her eyes dart between Khalid and the groom, each step they take toward her amplifying her turmoil. The weight of the moment presses down on her, making her feel as though the walls are closing in. Khalid steps forward, his gaze unwavering and filled with intensity. His voice is calm, but carries an undeniable authority. "Aisha," he says, his tone softening, almost pleading. You know this is where you belong. You made a promise not just to me, but to yourself. You can't deny what we had, what we still have. Aisha's head lowers further, her tears falling faster now. Her hands tremble as they rise to her face, covering her mouth in a futile attempt to suppress a sob. The room is silent, except for her quiet cries, and the guests exchange uneasy glances, their whispers fading into nothing as the gravity of the situation sinks in. The groom's face flushes with anger and desperation. He steps in front of Aisha, shielding her from Khalid with his broad shoulders. "Stop it!" he barks, his voice rising. "She doesn't want anything to do with you. Can't you see what you're doing to her? Leave her alone." Khalid's expression doesn't waver, his piercing eyes fixed on Aisha, ignoring the groom's outburst. "I'm not here to hurt her," Khalid replies, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to remind her of who she is, of the life we planned before fear and circumstance tore us apart." The groom's jaw tightens, his fists clenching at his sides. "Who she is?" he spits, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's my bride. That's who she is. And you're just some pathetic relic from her past trying to drag her back into a world she doesn't belong to anymore." Khalid's lips press into a thin line, his composure unshaken by the groom's words. "You think you know her?" he says, his tone cutting. "You think the woman standing beside you is the same woman she's always been, but you don't see the conflict in her eyes, the fear in her heart. You don't know the truth she's too afraid to admit." The groom turns to Aisha, his voice softening as he steps closer to her. "Aisha," he says gently, his hands reaching out to touch her trembling shoulders. "Don't listen to him. You're not the person he's trying to make you out to be. You're strong, brave, and ready to move forward. Tell him he's wrong. Tell him you don't belong with him." Aisha lifts her tear-streaked face, her eyes locking briefly with the groom's before shifting back to Khalid. Her lips tremble as she struggles to speak, the weight of their expectations pressing heavily on her chest. Her silence stretches on, each passing second deepening the tension in the room. Khalid steps closer, his voice softening again, but losing none of its intensity. "You don't have to be afraid, Aisha," he says. "I know you feel trapped, caught between two lives. But deep down, you know the truth. You know that your heart has always been with me." The groom snaps, his voice trembling with fury. "Enough!" he shouts, his protective stance becoming more aggressive. "Stop filling her head with lies. You don't get to decide what's best for her." Khalid holds his ground, his voice unshaken. "I'm not deciding anything," he says, his gaze never leaving Aisha. "The decision is hers. It always has been. But she deserves to make it with all the pieces of the truth." Aisha's shoulders slump further, her body trembling as the emotions overwhelm her. Her breaths come in shallow gasps, her tears falling in steady streams. The guests watch with bated breath, the tension in the air so thick it's almost suffocating. Caught between the groom's protective anger and Khalid's resolute determination, Aisha stands on the precipice of a choice that could alter her life forever. Yet, her silence persists, leaving the room suspended in an unbearable moment of uncertainty. Khalid takes a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling firmly on Aisha. His voice is calm but heavy with significance, each word carefully chosen. "It's time they all knew the truth," he begins, his tone slicing through the thick silence. "This isn't just about a promise, it's about a debt that was never paid, and a bond that was never broken." The guests lean forward in their seats, their whispers starting again, louder this time. "A debt?" someone mutters. "What is he talking about?" Another voice cuts in, filled with disbelief. "This is absurd. What kind of debt could be so important?" The groom steps forward, his face a mix of anger and confusion. "A debt?" he echoes, his voice sharp. "What kind of nonsense is this now? What debt could possibly justify this insanity?" Khalid ignores him, his focus solely on Aisha. "Your father," he says, his words measured and deliberate, He came to me when he was desperate, begging for my help. His business was failing, his debts piling up. He was drowning, Aisha, and I was his only lifeline. Aisha's breath catches, her trembling hands rising to her chest as if trying to steady her racing heart. The room erupts into a cacophony of gasps and whispers. "Her father!" a guest exclaims. "What does this have to do with her?" Another voice chimes in, skeptical. "This can't be real. It sounds like a fairy tale," Khalid continues, undeterred by the rising murmurs. "I gave him what he needed to survive," he says, his tone unwavering. "Not just money, but a promise to protect his family, to ensure that you, Aisha, would never face the struggles he endured. And in return, he promised me something. Someone." The groom's face twists in disbelief, his voice rising. "Someone? You're saying her father promised her to you? That's insane." Khalid nods, his expression unreadable. "It was an arrangement, one your father made to save everything he loved. He promised me his daughter's hand when the time was right. A promise he never intended to break, until life got in the way." Aisha's knees threaten to buckle, and she takes a shaky step backward. Her tears flow freely now, her face a portrait of heartbreak and confusion. "No," she whispers, her voice barely audible. "This can't be true. He wouldn't." The groom turns to her, his voice trembling with both anger and desperation. "Aisha, tell me this isn't true. Tell me he's lying." Aisha opens her mouth, but no words come out. Her eyes dart between Khalid and the groom, her hesitation only deepening the tension in the room. The guests erupt into a chorus of disbelief, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blend of shock and outrage. "This is outrageous!" one exclaims. "How could something like this happen?" The groom moves closer to Aisha, his hands gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "Aisha," he pleads, his voice softening, "please, I need to hear it from you. Did your father do this? Did he promise you to him?" Aisha's lip trembles as she lowers her gaze, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know," she finally stammers, her voice broken. "He never told me. Not until it was too late." The groom steps back as though struck, his hands falling to his sides. The room falls into stunned silence, save for Aisha's quiet sobs. Khalid steps forward, his voice softer now, almost regretful. "You didn't ask for this," he says gently, addressing Aisha. "But neither did I. I only came here to honor the promise your father made, to remind you of the life we were supposed to have." The groom turns on Khalid, his voice sharp and filled with fury. "You can't justify this," he spits. "This is her life, not some deal to be traded like property." Khalid's gaze remains steady. "It was never about a deal," he says quietly. "It was about a bond, one that was meant to protect her, not hurt her." Aisha looks up, her tear-filled eyes meeting Khalid's. Her lips quiver as she tries to speak, but the words remain trapped in her throat. The tension in the room is unbearable, every guest holding their breath as they wait for her to break the silence. But Aisha's hesitation only deepens the divide, leaving the truth hanging heavily in the air, unresolved. Khalid steps forward, his gaze steady, and his voice carrying a deep, resolute tone. "You want the full truth," he begins, addressing both the bride and the room. "Then let me tell you everything. Let me tell you why I'm here, why I've come for Aisha." The hall grows silent again, save for the soft rustling of whispers among the guests. Khalid's commanding presence seems to fill every corner of the space as he speaks. "Years ago, I wasn't the man you see standing here. I wasn't a billionaire, a man of power and influence. I was just a young man trying to survive, with nothing to my name but a drive to succeed. And then I met her." He turns his gaze to Aisha, and his expression softens for the first time. "You were the only light in my life during those dark days," he says, his voice carrying a vulnerability that silences the murmurs around him. "You believed in me when no one else did. You gave me hope, a reason to fight for something greater." The scene transitions into a vivid flashback, the memories playing out as if unfolding in real time. Khalid is shown in his youth, dressed in modest clothes, working tirelessly at a small shop. The camera follows him to a chance meeting with Aisha, who enters the shop with a kind smile. Their initial exchange is simple, unassuming, but the connection between them is undeniable. The flashback deepens, revealing moments of quiet intimacy between them, walking along a moonlit street, sharing dreams of the future, and laughing over trivial things that seemed monumental in their shared world. Khalid's younger self is captivated by Aisha's unwavering belief in him, her gentle encouragement fueling his determination. "I promised you then," Khalid's voice continues, now narrating over the memories, "that I would build a life worthy of you. I told you that no matter how far I went, no matter how much time passed, I would return for you." The flashback shifts to a heartbreaking moment. Khalid, standing by a train station, a suitcase at his feet, his face filled with determination, but also pain. Aisha stands a few steps away, her face streaked with tears. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispers, her voice trembling. Khalid nods, his hand brushing against hers. "I will," he says firmly, "and when I do, nothing will keep us apart." The memory fades, and the focus returns to the present. Khalid's voice cracks slightly as he continues. "But life had other plans. By the time I returned, everything had changed. Your father, he refused to let me near you. He told me you were promised to someone else, that our time was over. I tried to fight it, but he made it clear that I would lose everything I had worked for if I didn't walk away." Aisha's shoulders shake as she listens, her tears falling freely. Her breaths come in short, shallow gasps, her heart breaking all over again as the memories flood her mind. The guests watch in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to sympathy. The groom, however, isn't moved. He steps forward, his voice cutting through the emotion in the room. "So that's it?" he demands. "A sob story about how life was unfair? That doesn't justify barging in here and ruining everything. You're just trying to manipulate her." Khalid shakes his head, his gaze never leaving Aisha. "This isn't about justification," he says. "It's about the truth. A truth she deserves to hear before she makes a decision that will change her life forever." Aisha's knees buckle and she sinks to the floor, her gown pooling around her. Her hands cover her face as sobs rack her body. "It's true," she finally whispers, her voice barely audible. "It's all true." The room erupts in gasps, and the groom's face pales. "What are you saying?" he asks, his voice trembling. "Aisha, you can't mean that." Aisha looks up, her tear-streaked face filled with anguish. "I loved him," she confesses, her voice breaking. "I loved him more than anything, and when he left, I thought I would never see him again. I thought I had no choice but to move on." Her words cut through the room like a knife, leaving everyone stunned. The groom stares at her, his face a mix of pain and betrayal. "And now?" he asks, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you still love him?" Aisha's gaze shifts to Khalid, her tears falling faster. Her silence speaks volumes, leaving the room hanging on the edge of an emotional precipice. The truth is out, but the storm it has unleashed is far from over. The groom stands frozen, his face pale and his eyes filled with disbelief. The weight of Aisha's confession crushes him, and his voice trembles as he takes a hesitant step toward her. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asks, his words barely above a whisper. "Why would you let me believe all of this, only to find out like this?" Aisha can't meet his gaze. Her hands tremble as they clutch the fabric of her gown, and her tears fall steadily, staining the pristine ivory of her dress. "I didn't know how," she finally says, her voice breaking. "I didn't think it mattered anymore. I thought it was in the past." The groom's expression twists into a mixture of hurt and anger. "In the past?" he repeats, his voice rising. "Aisha, you promised me a future. You stood beside me, let me believe we were building something real. And now I find out you've been holding on to this? That he was always in the back of your mind?" The guests begin murmuring, their voices rising into a chaotic blend of opinions. "She should have told him," someone whispers. "He deserved to know before all of this." Another voice counters, "But can you blame her? She must have been terrified of what the truth would do." Some guests turn their attention to Khalid, their expressions a mixture of admiration and resentment. "He's the one who started all of this," one man mutters. "If he had stayed away, none of this would be happening." The room becomes a battleground of divided loyalties. On one side, guests sympathize with the groom, their whispers carrying tones of pity and indignation. "He's the one who's been betrayed," a woman says, shaking her head. "Imagine planning your life with someone only to find out they've been hiding this." On the other side, a smaller group begins to see Khalid's perspective. "He's just trying to fight for the woman he loves," one man says, his voice low but firm. "It's not his fault her father kept them apart. Should he have just stayed silent forever?" Caught in the storm of voices and conflicting emotions, Aisha's inner turmoil becomes palpable. She looks between the two men, her tears glistening under the chandelier's soft light. Her heart feels like it's being pulled in opposite directions, one by the promises she made long ago and the love she once knew, and the other by the stability and affection she found in the groom, who had stood by her when she needed someone the most. Her voice trembles as she speaks, trying to address the groom, her words filled with guilt. "You have to understand," she says, her hands shaking. "I thought I had moved on. I thought I could leave that part of my life behind, but seeing him again, hearing everything I've tried to bury—" She pauses, struggling to find the right words. "I never wanted to hurt you." The groom shakes his head, his pain visible in the way his shoulders slump, and his voice falters. "But you did," he says softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Whether you meant to or not, you did." Khalid steps forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "I didn't come here to destroy her life," he says firmly. "I came here to remind her of the life we once dreamed of. The life we were meant to have before it was taken from us." The groom turns to him, his anger flaring again. "And what about me?" he snaps. "Do you think you can just walk in here and erase everything we've built? Everything I've done for her?" Khalid's gaze remains steady. "I don't want to erase anything," he says. "I just want her to choose, freely, without fear, without lies, without regret." The room falls silent again, the guests watching as Aisha crumbles under the weight of the moment. Her tears flow unchecked, her heart visibly torn between the two men who have shaped her life in different ways. The tension in the hall is unbearable, the air thick with unspoken words and emotions too heavy to express. And as the clock ticks on, everyone waits for her to break the silence, to make the decision that will change all their lives forever. Aisha stands motionless in the center of the aisle, the weight of her conflicting emotions visible in every trembling breath. Her gaze shifts between Khalid, standing firm with his piercing, unrelenting eyes, and the groom, whose expression is a mixture of heartbreak and desperation. The room holds its breath, every guest leaning forward, waiting for her to speak. Her voice is barely audible when she finally begins, trembling like a fragile thread holding her thoughts together. "I never wanted it to come to this," she says, her tears shimmering under the glow of the chandeliers. "I never wanted to hurt either of you." Her hands clutch her gown tightly, as though grounding herself in the midst of the storm swirling around her. Khalid steps forward, his tone softer, but filled with conviction. "Aisha," he says, his voice steady and heartfelt, "you know this isn't just chance. This is our destiny. You and I were meant to be together, and no matter how much time has passed, that hasn't changed. I've never stopped loving you, and I never will." His words hang in the air, wrapping around Aisha like a lifeline. She looks at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but then her gaze shifts to the groom, who takes a step closer, his voice breaking as he speaks. "Aisha, please," he says, his hands outstretched. "I've been there for you through everything. I've loved you with my whole heart, and I never asked for anything in return except for you to trust me. Don't throw that away for a memory." Aisha's tears fall faster now, her hands trembling as she covers her face. The whispers among the guests grow louder, their divided opinions echoing in the grand hall. She has to choose the groom, one voice murmurs. He's the one who's been by her side. Another counters, but Khalid clearly loves her. They have a history that can't just be ignored. The groom steps closer, his voice rising in urgency. Look at me, Aisha, he pleads. I've been your rock, your safe place. Everything I've done has been for you, for us. You don't have to throw that away. Khalid takes another step forward, his voice unwavering. And I've waited for you, Aisha. Through years of pain, through everything life threw at me, I held onto the hope that one day we'd find our way back to each other. That day is today. Aisha's shoulders shake as sobs rack her body, the weight of their words pressing heavily on her. She looks between them, her gaze flickering like a candle caught in the wind, her mind racing with memories, emotions, and impossible choices. The groom's voice softens, his desperation giving way to raw vulnerability. I love you, Aisha, he says, his tone trembling. I've loved you through everything, and I'll keep loving you no matter what. Just, please, don't let him take you away from me. Khalid's expression remains steady, though a flicker of emotion passes through his eyes. You don't have to be afraid, Aisha, he says. I'm not asking you to choose out of obligation. I'm asking you to choose what your heart truly wants. The room falls silent again, every eye fixed on Aisha as she stands at the crossroads of her life. Her tears slowly subside, replaced by a look of quiet determination. She takes a deep breath, her trembling hands finally steadying as she raises her head. The tension in the hall is palpable, the air thick with anticipation as she prepares to speak. Both men stand before her, waiting, their emotions laid bare. Aisha's voice is soft, but carries a strength that silences the murmurs around her. I can't, she begins, her voice cracking. She pauses, drawing another deep breath, as she prepares to utter the words that will define the rest of their lives. The room is silent, save for the faint sound of Aisha's unsteady breathing. She stands in the center of the aisle, her tear-streaked face framed by the golden light of the chandeliers above. Her hands grip the fabric of her gown, steadying herself as the weight of her decision presses down on her shoulders. She looks at Khalid, his intense gaze unwavering, his expression filled with both longing and hope. Then she turns to the groom, his face etched with pain and quiet desperation, his eyes pleading with her to stay. Aisha closes her eyes, her chest rising and falling as she takes a deep, trembling breath. When she finally speaks, her voice is soft, but resolute, cutting through the suffocating silence of the hall. I'm sorry, she says, her words faltering under the weight of her emotions. I never wanted to hurt either of you. I never wanted this. Her voice cracks, and a fresh wave of tears spills down her cheeks as she opens her eyes, locking them on Khalid. Her decision is made. Khalid, she says, her voice trembling but firm, I can't go back. The life we dreamed of, it's gone. We're not the same people we were back then. I've built something new, something different, and I can't turn my back on it, no matter how much it hurts. The words hang in the air, heavy and final. The groom's breath hitches, his eyes wide with disbelief as he processes her choice. His hands drop to his sides, and he takes a shaky step back, his face pale, and his expression a mixture of heartbreak and stunned silence. He doesn't say a word, but the pain in his eyes is unmistakable. Khalid's posture stiffens, his sharp features briefly hardening before softening into something quieter. Acceptance. He nods slowly, his jaw tightening as he swallows the lump forming in his throat. I understand, he says, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. I wanted a chance to remind you of what we once had, but I see now that your heart is no longer with me. His eyes linger on her for a moment, and then he takes a step back, his commanding presence retreating as though the fight within him has finally faded. I'll respect your decision, Aisha, he says softly. I only hope that you find the happiness you deserve. The groom, still reeling from her words, finally speaks, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Aisha, he whispers, his tone trembling. After everything, after all we've been through, you're still choosing him? Aisha shakes her head, tears flowing freely. I'm not choosing him, she says, her voice barely audible. I'm choosing myself, and I'm choosing to move forward. The guests remain silent, their collective breath held as the scene unfolds. The room feels heavy, charged with emotions too raw to process. Khalid takes another step back, his eyes lingering on her one last time before he turns and walks away, his shoulders squared but his heart clearly weighed down. The groom stands frozen, his pain written across his face as Aisha looks at him, her tears reflecting both guilt and a quiet strength. The moment stretches, unbearable in its intensity, as the three lives intertwined in this drama begin to unravel, each thread pulling in a different direction. The room erupts in a cacophony of gasps and murmurs as the weight of Aisha's decision settles over the guests. Some look on in disbelief, their faces frozen in shock, while others whisper among themselves, their hushed voices carrying a mix of judgment and sympathy. How could she choose this? A woman mutters, shaking her head in disbelief. After all this drama, I can't believe she didn't go back to Khalid. Another guest leans closer to her companion. Maybe she's stronger than we think, he says. Choosing neither of them, that takes courage. The groom stands motionless, his face pale and his eyes unfocused, as if the world around him has blurred into a dull hum. His hands hang limp at his sides, and the confident, proud man who had walked to the altar earlier now appears broken, his dreams shattered in front of everyone. In the midst of the chaos, Aisha takes a deep breath, her tears slowing as she looks down at her trembling hands. The room's noise fades into the background, replaced by the quiet storm of her own thoughts. She closes her eyes, her mind flashing back to the pivotal moments that have shaped her journey. The first memory surfaces, her younger self standing with Khalid under the stars, their laughter mingling with the gentle rustling of leaves. His promise echoes in her mind, vivid and full of hope. I'll come back for you, he had said, his hand brushing against hers. Her younger self had smiled, her eyes full of trust and dreams for the future. The scene shifts to her father's study, where she had overheard hushed voices, Khalid's name mentioned in anger. Her father's voice is stern, forbidding any connection to the man she had loved. It's for the best, her father had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The memory of her silent tears as she packed away letters and keepsakes pierces her like a blade. Another memory takes its place, the moment she met the groom. His kindness, his unwavering support during some of her darkest days, plays in her mind like a gentle melody. He had been there for her, a steady presence who offered her stability when she had needed it most. His smile, his patience, his love. These moments flood her heart with both gratitude and pain. The montage ends with a reflection of the present, Khalid walking away, his shoulders squared but his heart heavy. The groom standing a few feet away, his face etched with pain and disbelief. Aisha's chest tightens as she opens her eyes, the weight of her choice pressing heavily on her. The murmurs of the guests rise again, their whispers blending into a sea of emotions. Aisha takes a shaky step forward, then stops. She turns to the groom, her voice barely audible but resolute. I didn't mean to hurt you, she says, her tone filled with remorse. You've been my anchor when I felt like I was drifting, but this choice wasn't just about love. It was about finding who I am. The groom doesn't respond, his face unreadable as her words hang in the air. Aisha looks around the room, her gaze brushing over the stunned guests. She exhales deeply, her shoulders sagging as the emotional toll of the day finally catches up to her. The moments replay in her mind, each memory a thread in the tapestry of her life. As she stands in the center of the grand hall, her tears slow, replaced by a quiet, bittersweet strength. She realizes that her decision, though painful, was the only way to truly free herself. From her past, from expectations, and from the shadows that had loomed over her for so long. Aisha stands at the center of the aisle, the weight of the day etched across her tear-streaked face. The grand hall, once filled with laughter and celebration, now feels suffocating and heavy. With one final deep breath, she straightens her posture, her trembling hand smoothing the fabric of her gown. The room watches in silence, guests frozen in their seats, unsure of what will happen next. She begins to walk, her steps slow and deliberate, the soft rustle of her gown the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. She doesn't look back, neither at the altar nor at Khalid and the groom, who stand on opposite sides of the aisle, their gazes fixed on her retreating form. The once vibrant chandeliers above cast a dim, almost somber glow over the room, as though reflecting the collective weight of the moment. As she reaches the grand doors of the venue, they swing open, revealing the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The warmth washes over her, contrasting with the cold, stifling atmosphere she's leaving behind. She pauses for a moment at the threshold, the world beyond the door bright and full of possibilities. A soft breeze brushes her face, carrying with it a sense of freedom she hasn't felt in years. Aisha takes a step forward, leaving behind the expectations, the heartbreak, and the chains of her past. The camera lingers on her as she walks down the long stone steps leading away from the venue. Her veil catches the breeze, fluttering behind her like a symbol of letting go, of moving forward into an uncertain but self-determined future. Just as she reaches the end of the path, a car pulls up, a sleek black vehicle that gleams in the sunlight. The window lowers, and for a moment, all that's visible is the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat. His hand, adorned with an elegant watch, rests casually on the wheel. Aisha stops, her eyes narrowing slightly as she peers at the figure. The camera zooms in on her face, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition. The man leans slightly forward, his features still obscured by shadows, but his voice is unmistakable, calm, deep, and filled with an enigmatic familiarity. "I thought you might need a ride." Aisha's breath catches as she takes a step closer, her gown trailing behind her. The screen fades to black before the man's identity is fully revealed, leaving the audience in suspense, their minds racing with questions. The final scene is accompanied by the faint sound of the car door opening, hinting at a twist yet to unfold. The credits roll, leaving the audience speechless and eager for what might come next.